It's great to be here. Thanks for coming out. Hopefully we'll make it, applicable to you. How can it make a difference with the way you relate to your students? I have tons of international students that come into the ILC, second language folks. And actually, even though it's about Asian thinking, in a lot of cases, Middle Eastern thinking and African cultures often share certain characteristics as opposed to Western culture. So hopefully it's something to get you thinking. Even though I'm not in the healthcare profession myself, I think there's a lot of ways you'll see that culture does affect the way people think about healthcare and how they treat doctors, nurses, and professionals. I just wanted to start out with a little story. About 3 years ago, a friend of mine named Ruth, she was at a place called Tiger Kingdom, which was kind of like a zoo per se, a small zoo, where the tourists in Chiang Mai, Thailand could interact with tigers that were up to 1.5 years old. So these are full-grown tigers that you could lie down on the ground, you could play with them, you could pet them, wrestle them. They had a little show. So Ruth was there. She's a Kiwi from New Zealand, and she and her husband and 2 daughters were there at the show. Well, when the trainer started doing some activities with the tigers, Ruth got kind of a bad feeling about this one tiger kind of looking at her. And so the trainer noticed it too, and so he said to her, in Thai, please have a seat there. When she went to sit down, the tiger lunged at her, got a hold of her hip, okay, and would not let go. The trainer panicked and he ran away. And Ruth didn't know what to do. She's screaming in pain. And this other friend of mine that taught at this international high school with me, he took his hands and he pried open the tiger's jaws to get it away from Ruth. Finally, the trainer returned with the owner. Ruth is now bleeding, right, from the tiger attack. Everybody's panicked and scattered. They get in the car with the owner. It turns out they did not have a first aid kit at Tiger Kingdom. There was nothing to treat any kind of tiger wounds or disasters or accidents. In the car on the way to the hospital for about 20 minutes, the owner is driving them personally, saying, please, please, please don't tell anyone that this happened. This would be very bad for my business. Okay, in the end, this woman actually was great to them, and she paid for all their health care and so on. But it took Ruth about 3 months to recover because there was an infection from the tiger bite that they did not know how to treat because it's so unusual. Culturally, this isn't that surprising for certain reasons, which we'll get into later. When I was 31, I guess, my husband and I and my 6-month-old daughter moved to Thailand to work with a nonprofit, a Christian organization there, and we also worked with a foundation that helped the handicapped. And one thing, so I totally get how the international students feel. I went to language school for 20 months. I became so amazing at speaking and writing the Thai language that I could pass the 6th grade exam. And that was a huge accomplishment. And I never really did become I could communicate, I could teach, I could do things, but I was never like a well-spoken, well-educated person in their culture. I was always the outsider, and I was always the phalang, which means the Western girl, and I just know what it's like to be on the outside of a culture. But I do find it really fascinating in how different cultural groups have a completely different take on what it means to communicate with respect and what their priorities are, and how we deal with safety issues, medical care, and how we treat people in authority over us. All these things became, a lifelong study as I interacted as the foreigner, the outsider in that culture. Here I just wanted to start with this real kind of obvious statement that the more we understand other cultural points of view, the more we understand our own culture. And sometimes people kind of project onto us, oh, you didn't like America, so you went somewhere else. It was like, that's not what it's about at all. But the more you understand other cultures, the more you can see the one you're in, right? It's like the fish in water. It's hard to describe what water is to the fish because it's all he knows, right? And when we don't go outside our culture, we don't know all these other ways that are perfectly normal to a whole nother group of people. And hopefully this will help you to serve your students and them to serve their patients, okay, more effectively. Now, this is just one aspect of Asian culture that we're going to touch on, but in general, since the 1950s, sociologists have defined Western cultures as being guilt-based and Asian cultures being shame-based. Okay, and these create different situations. We're going to deal with some things that don't center around that, but that is one major difference. Now, studies are being done now about whether they can really be categorically divided that way, because all of us know what it's like to feel shame. Okay, shame is about being negatively evaluated by others. Okay, your family, your parents, your siblings, your friends, your spouse, your children, whoever. And this can be real or imagined, okay? What you think people think of you is shame, all right? It's associated also with trying to hide or cover over our weaknesses, okay, so we don't experience shame. Guilt, on the other hand, which is more uniquely Western, okay, involves being negatively evaluated by oneself. I don't live up to my own expectations for myself, and I feel guilt. There's a lot of jokes often about Catholic schools or, you know, our Puritan roots, that we are a very guilt-ridden culture. But often it's more about the individual feeling personal guilt as opposed to shame from the community. On the other hand, you know, they're looking more and more and saying, this is my caveat at the bottom, you know, current cross-cultural research is questioning that entire cultures fall on one side or the other and that one is really better than the other. Of course, Westerners doing the research historically have said guilt is more positive. Guilt increases your self-esteem and your empathy, whereas shame leads people to avoid, withdraw, to have repressed anger, and then blame. So I think, obviously, we can't say some cultures, you know, are superior to others, that kind of thing. What we're just saying is we're all a big mix, you know, and depending on your upbringing, usually how much shame, okay, your parents may have put on you versus they're emphasizing responsibility for yourself, okay, we're all a mix of experiencing some shame and some guilt, okay? Or maybe you grew up in a family where there's no shame and no guilt, right? And then that'd be interesting. I'm sure someone studied that, but does that exist? I don't know. Okay, if nothing's ever wrong, maybe. Particularly, you might think of shame connected with if you've seen movies like Pearl Harbor, or where they really emphasize the Japanese mindset. If we lose this war, we can't return back. We would kill ourselves rather than return home not victorious. That kind of idea that you have to be so careful to bring honor to your family and your social environment as opposed to shame or failure. Okay, so I want to talk about what I consider Asian priorities or values. And let me just say, you know, some of my master's work was on cross-cultural communication, but I am not an expert on Asia. Asia is this vastly diverse part of the world. I lived in one place in Southeast Asia. I interacted with primarily Buddhists from, well, some tribal people also from an animistic background, but mostly mainstream type people that speak Central and Northern Thai. They're Southeast Asians, and they're pretty urban. Although a lot of the women that I knew came from more remote backgrounds as well. So there's a mix. But in any case, I think I have 4 what I consider values or priorities for the Asian way of thinking. This one is real obvious when you think of my tiger story. Okay? They focus on the present. They're considered a non-crisis culture, whereas Americans, Germans, most Western Europeans are very much a crisis culture. Now it's become intensified and often ridiculous because we have to now print on the coffee cup, you know, contents could be hot. Because of lawsuits, it's become even more crazy in our, you know, what's the word, you know, say again? Yeah, there you go. And our efforts to just make sure that nothing harms someone and to be super safe. My husband's a civil engineer by background, and he used to jokingly say in Thailand, you know, safety last. Because it just compared to our culture, it seemed like they were not interested in preparing for crises. But again, it's just a mindset. They deal with a crisis in creative ways when it happens, whereas we plan ahead and think of all the partial, you know, different things that could happen. at the ILC, I was looking. If a shooter enters our building, it's telling me what to do. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. Now, another example of this is we had these big elephant camps that tourists go to in my city, in Chiang Mai, and you can just walk around, you know, with the elephants. And I personally, I'm kind of a cautious person with large animals, so I would really keep my distance. But a friend of mine who had surgery at the hospital had another back surgery patient who was there because he was holding a bunch of bananas, which he was planning to feed to an elephant, he didn't notice, and the elephant grabbed them out of his arm and did massive injury to his back. And so I was always amazed because I thought in America you would just never find people kind of just mingling with the elephants, you know, when they could kill you so quickly. I heard another story of an elephant that someone, for a joke, pulled its tail, and the elephant grabbed him with his trunk and killed him, you know? So they seem friendly and nice, and they do play the harmonica and kick soccer balls, but they can also kill you. So it's interesting in that our emphasis on planning for culture for crisis is totally different. I also just wanted to say, in a lot of cases, it depends. You might say, I know Asians from, you know, big cities in all over Asia that are much more Western in their thinking now, okay? And then it's often more rural areas that would be less crisis-oriented, for example, okay? So again, it's hard to make hard, fast lines about culture. A second Asian priority is the one that you want to avoid causing someone to lose face at all costs. And this is huge. And I didn't really get this at all when, I mean, I knew it in theory, but you don't really get stuff until you're living it, you know. And not only to cover your own mistakes so you don't lose face, but also to save others when you think you could cause them to lose face. Okay, and this is really important, and I have a lot of examples of this. The desire to avoid shaming others means sometimes people say yes to you when they really mean no. Okay? The belief is that if you contradict someone that's in authority over you and cause them to lose face, then you have shamed them, okay, and you're doing something that's disrespectful, that's unacceptable. Now, the end result is that Westerners often perceive people that hold this cultural view, we think that they're being two-faced, they say one thing but do something else, or we think they're lying, okay? And the truth is, for their culture, this is the way to show respect, to smooth over conflict and not emphasize it, especially in front of other people, okay? They have different ways of solving conflict than we do. And so it's important to think about how this has a lot of ramifications in the healthcare situation. For example, one of my friends, okay, so this is what we were told when we went to Thailand, is don't question, Thais do not question the doctors. The doctors are so well educated and you are like nothing, and so it is not your place, it's considered rude to ask them questions or to especially like question that you should be given that medication or that treatment. So, but we, like our children's pediatrician, he practiced in St. Louis for 15 years, he was used to us, you know, and if you're a Westerner, they give you more space. But especially if you're an uneducated Thai person in that culture, it was considered unacceptable. So a good friend of mine, well, she actually worked for us in our home, okay? So she's not very well educated, and she, her brother actually could not breathe. He had this episode where he could not breathe. He had this adverse reaction to these drugs that he'd been given. His friend ran with him in his arms. It was like 3 blocks away to the hospital. This was a huge public hospital. Now, it's a little better now, but at that time, they gave out little baggies of Ziplocs of pills, and they didn't even label them, okay? So my friend, she's trying to find out what drug caused that horrible reaction in her brother that he almost died and couldn't breathe. And they refused to tell her the name of the drug. Okay, they just refused to tell her. Okay, when we moved home after 18 years, I wanted to get my medical records, and I was told the hospital generally does not release medical records. I'm like, what do you mean? And actually, it took me a while to realize they're all written in Thai. Who's going to read them anyway? You know what I'm saying? Here, no one can read them. But so I was like, never mind. But they're like hospitals compete and so they don't want to release the records. Okay, so there's this idea often that you're not supposed to challenge people that are in authority over you. Here's a few examples. You might ask a student, that you've been helping, would you be willing to go home and work on this for a couple hours tonight? And they might know there's no way they can do that. They're working, they're busy, whatever, and they say yes because they don't want to be rude to you. Okay, they don't perceive it as lying, it's just being polite to you. The same thing could happen with a medication. Maybe you debate the pros and cons of a certain medication. It might have these side effects, this could be difficult, but would you be willing? And they might say yes because they think that's what you want them to say. Okay? To us it's confusing because we're so much more direct. If you explain something to a student and they still don't understand it, they do not want to shame you by pointing out that you're a poor explainer of the material, and they will say yes, they understand it when you ask them. So really, in an application point, you might not ask them if they understand. You might ask them questions to find out if they understand, that kind of thing. Okay, and we'll discuss. We'll create some discussion time for some of this at the end here. If a doctor asks a patient, do you exercise at least three times a week? They might say yes to avoid it. Now, the truth is Americans do this too, right? My dentist commented to my husband, she always asks people, do you floss, how many times a week? And then she can tell they totally don't, even though they lie and say they do, because their gums bleed so much, And so it's human to some degree, right? It's not necessarily Asian, but it's just more. It's just more. Okay, another one is indirect communication is considered more polite than direct communication. And this was my least favorite because I'm direct even for an American. And Americans can be a little, blunt or in your face or whatever, and I like that. I like to really know what people are thinking, and I tend to say it. And so in Thai culture, that is not really done, okay? If you say one thing, you just have to be careful. Okay. Let me go back. Okay, I had a few more examples about the focusing on the present, not being crisis-oriented. Another example of this would be the lack of helmets, okay? Lots and lots of people, probably more than half, drive motorcycles in my city. Lots of times you'll see 3 people on a motorcycle. Their entire family has to get on that motorcycle because of economic reasons, but frequently no helmets at all, even though it's the law technically. In our province, we had 1 person die per day of motorcycle injuries. So generally it was the older women that wore the helmets the most. And occasionally I saw mothers that would have their children in these little tiny helmets. But a lot of times they were like thin plastic. They wouldn't even help you. So sometimes it was financial, sometimes lack of education. But again, it's like you just plan not to crash, okay, in that culture, as opposed to us planning for the worst case scenario. Causing people to lose face, I had a few other examples. When we first rented our house, we were really fortunate. The second house we lived in for 14 years. That was the longest I'd ever lived anywhere. My dad was in the Air Force. And when we rented the house, the woman told us she was planning to live in it with her husband, but he died. And so that's why she was going to rent it to us. And it worked out great. She was an amazing landlord. And my husband used to go to her every month to get his hair cut. She was also, a beautician. And they became really good friends. Well, about 12 years later, she let something slip about her husband. And he said, I thought you said your husband died. And she said, oh, well, I didn't know you then, and I was embarrassed to say that my husband left me, so I just told you that he died. So that was like a situation where you just cover it over, rather than say something embarrassing. I once also, when I was, a very young teacher, I was teaching in this suburban high school in Houston, Texas, and I noticed this Chinese student translating each individual word in like a 20-page story. She didn't want to ask for help. She just went through translating each individual word into a Chinese character. I mean, that's determination, isn't it? I love a lot of these international students because they work so hard, doubly hard, to do their writing. And a lot of them are just missing some one word can turn their whole assignment, okay, or concept, or make them do poorly on a test or whatever. So those are just a few examples of not wanting to lose face, not wanting to lose face. Okay, let's keep going. Oh, you're interested maybe in this indirect communication. And what do you mean? What are you talking about? Okay, Asians often utilize a neutral third person to help settle a problem. Okay, and this really, as an American, this kind of made me crazy because to what to them feels more polite, to me felt less polite. Okay, the idea is that you want to avoid causing embarrassment between the two people, so you get a third person to speak for you so you don't have to feel embarrassment. Okay, age and status is also really important. For example, Thai people, when they meet, they why each other. The younger person always whys the older person first. Okay, age and status, education, very important. Okay, I asked my friends, how long in the Bible it says you should honor your parents, right? We're talking about honoring our parents, obeying your parents. How long should you obey them? They said, all your life, okay? And I said, wow, you know, in my culture we think 18, 21, you know what I'm saying? You know, it's just a complete honor, yes, but obey, I think we have a very different concept than they do in that culture. So age is really important. Okay, if a patient doesn't like or understand a certain nurse, for example, they might go to another nurse, okay, and ask them to help. Or they might ask that nurse to talk to their nurse, that kind of a situation. Now, in a lot of cases, they just won't pursue the conflict. But if they're really desperate, okay, to work it out, they might go get another person, or they might talk to the nurse's aide, right? Something like that, to talk to the nurse. If they really connect with one instructor but not the other, they might ask that instructor to talk to the other one, for example, to let them retake a test or something like that. To us, we think that's completely inappropriate. I don't know, but that's from my cultural point of view. I'm offended when you bring a third person in. Okay, I think this is between us, right? Okay, but to them, they think it's more respectful. They are trying to show more respect in many, definitely Asian cultures and some others, I believe, as well. I worked with a group of women for 14 years that met weekly in my home, and it was like a Christian life, spiritual, you know, emphasis kind of group. And a lot of them, I helped them get jobs as maids in people's homes, okay? And so then I became that neutral third person that they wanted to use all the time when they had problems with their employers. So I was like a mini employment agency, you know? But of course I wanted to help them because they needed employment, right? They're trying to provide for their families, but when they had issues, Anne was the person that they should call on if they need a raise, they need some time off, this person doesn't understand them, things like that. And so I, as an American, felt incredibly awkward because I felt like I was getting into their business, do you know what I mean? That felt inappropriate from my cultural point of view. But from their point of view, they're trying to do the respectful thing to their boss and not embarrass their boss. Now, I knew their boss probably felt now more embarrassed if they were a Westerner by me getting involved. So it got interesting. But you can see how it really does affect, you know, your perceptions of what is socially correct and respectful in a lot of ways. Ironically, because of this status issue that people higher than you, do not make mistakes, or you're not allowed to point out when they make mistakes. For example, if some of these young women that went to churches, they said, our pastor he never shows that he makes mistakes. And she said, they said, that's our favorite thing about you, Anne. You tell us the bad stuff that you do. And I found that interesting and ironic. But in their culture, see, they looked up to me as like their leader, right, in the Christian realm. But I tried to be very open about my shortcomings because then they could relate to me, right? And that's part of my culture anyway. I just tend to be a vulnerable type person, or put it out there. But in their culture, that's unusual, okay? All right, here's another Asian value or priority. They often value relationships over efficiency or time constraints. And you may be aware of this, but lateness, for example, okay, I'll just give you one example, is measured completely differently by different cultures. All right, Americans and Germans get annoyed in 15 minutes if you are late. If you're a late person, this is good to take note of, okay? In 5 minutes, we get a little perturbed. You know, you think, nah, they'll be here in a minute. Maybe 10, you start thinking, really? Okay, 15, you're annoyed for most Americans. 30, you are ticked off. You're really, really mad. They're wasting your time, okay? And obviously, this isn't everyone. But this guy that wrote this book about cross-cultural communications, he said he had to wait for his wife a lot. He would pick her up after work, and she was a professor, and she was always late. And he said, by 30 minutes, I'd be steaming, you know? And in Latin time, it takes an hour to get annoyed, 2 hours to get angry. Islander time, 2 hours before you get annoyed, 4 hours before you get angry. So you can see how completely different time is viewed by different groups. And the guy that wrote this book worked on this tiny little Pacific island, I forget the name of it, and he said there was a situation where there were services going on in this little church, and there was a German woman there, and after 30 minutes she was just off the charts because they hadn't come out, and they were ready for the next service to start, and she rang the bell. The German woman rang the bell. Well, all the islanders were like, hey, it's all about the service, the event, the things we're doing. They had a guest speaker there. They were completely humiliated, you know, and they were prolifically apologizing to their guest speaker because the German woman clearly was out of her mind. You know, what did it matter that it took an extra hour for the service? The next group would wait. They knew how important that service was. Do you see what I'm saying? A good example of this for me was when we first moved to Thailand. Of course, we couldn't speak Thai very well. We did all that language school, but what we really need is friends that will let us practice on them, right? And we had these friends named Gay and Jup, and Gay and Jup would come over often on a Sunday afternoon and just chat with us. But the problem for me is they would never tell me in advance, and then they would stay for hours. And my headache would get bigger and bigger as I spoke Thai longer and longer because it was so much work for me mentally, okay? And so inside, from my American culture, I'd be like, they didn't even call. I already had plans. Oh my gosh, they're here for 3 hours. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, and really, that was my job. That's all I should have been doing is enjoying the relationship. I should have thanked them profusely, you know, just for being friends with us when we were so bad at the language. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we gave things to each other. But again, from my cultural perspective, time is valuable. And if you use too much of it without my knowledge and consent, I get worked up about it. Whereas in the event-oriented cultures, time is there to enjoy. Well, people are more important than time, right? Okay? And we tend to not think in those terms. Okay, so, this is a little bit what I was just saying. Our emphasis is on doing tasks, getting things done, and the future, planning for the future, and also we like our privacy. One time my parents were there, and I had 2 little kids, and we had all these presents under the tree on Christmas morning, and people came to my house. Now, I don't know about you, but in my culture, you do not come to my house on Christmas morning. That's like so taboo to me. And then I also felt embarrassed because it made me feel really materialistic, okay, which I am, okay, because these were poor people, right? I felt embarrassed. But it also just feels like, you know, something in my culture says call before you show up. In their culture, it says people are important to us. If I showed up at an inopportune time for them, they would welcome me gladly. Do you see what I'm saying? Just a difference in, I think it's a beautiful thing about many cultures that we lack, actually. We think we're people-oriented, but comparatively, sometimes not. Okay, so this is just an overview of Asian thinking. If we put it all together, there tends to be an emphasis on the present as opposed to future possible crises or problems, into enjoying the moment rather than planning for the future or getting tasks done. A person goes to great lengths to avoid shaming someone or embarrassing them or mentioning a conflict. okay? And so you use a third person to smooth over the conflicts, or in some cases, you just bury it. You just bury it deep down, and then maybe it comes out later. Yeah, this is actually tricky in Thai culture because a lot of men have two wives. They call it your first wife and your second wife. And sometimes the wife knows about the other wife, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes they kind of know, and then they bury it for a long, long time. And then those end up, the women, in prison because they killed their husbands or something like that. Because the rage was actually there, but it just got pushed down for a really long time. Yeah, so it doesn't always work well. But fourth, they really embrace relationships over efficiency and are less concerned about the time constraints that we would be. So that is really what I've put together for you.